Hi. All right, and we're live, I think. Welcome, everyone, to, I'm going to keep it to my face, I keep moving this around, to another event from the NYU Game Center lecture series. I'm really pleased today to welcome Ethan Red, who is going to speak about his practice and theories as a game designer and multimedia designer and artist, about what games, and precisely, I think, like action games should and can do as a form and a medium. Ethan is the creative lead at Virtuoso Neomedia, which is a NYC-based powerhouse of a studio, I think really responsible for a lot of stylish-looking games, which I will leave it to him to talk about and not step on that. So instead, I'll talk a little bit about Ethan's relationship with us at NYU Game Center, which is pretty extensive. You were a no-quarter artist in 2018, which you came to make a cool arcade game called Murder Boys, and also has worked with our own Mitu Kandekar at the studio Glow Up Games, working on the upcoming game, I think, based on the HBO series Insecure, I want to say. And also taught for us, which is how I know him. He was a thesis advisor for us last year, which was a tumultuous year for having a thesis. But I think he imparted great, wisdom and harsh takes for our students on how to make and, finish games with meaning and philosophy, which I really appreciated. But generally also, and the reason why we invited him here is on his sort of authority and expertise in very distinct kind of visual style making and art direction and creative direction for multiple mediums outside of games and inside games. And I think a very particular kind of aesthetic pull that you make from the Y2K era and like early arcade maximalism, which is really strong, but used in a very particular way to tell stories and show like emotionality in unexpected mediums, which I'm really excited to hear about. I'm thrilled to hear him talk, so I'll let him. So please join me in welcoming Ethan Red.
Hey everybody. This talk is emotive motion, and this is going to cover just sort of my approach and philosophies on expressive mechanical design. So before we get into that, just who is this guy, right? Founder and creative lead of Virtuoso Neomedia. We're a Brooklyn-based independent games and media production house. We're currently working on 3 games, Zodiac XX Leo, Killerado, and Raddminton. It's more about me. I'm a self-taught multimedia artist and game designer. I'm kind of known more for my visual work than game design at the moment, but I've always considered myself a game designer first. Actually, what got me into art was wanting to make my own games. So that's sort of the primary inspiration there. And I'm focused on heavily stylized 3D and fun-forward game design. So just a little bit of that in action. You can see just some clips of the games. And before we get started, I always slap a big IMO on my talks. This talk is not meant to be prescriptive, right? There is no right way or wrong way to make art. If you disagree with me, I did something good here. What this talk is the way to view games. It's just my way that I view games. It's not the philosophy and process of making games. This is my philosophy and process of making games. So your mileage will vary. Take that with a grain of salt. So, structure. We're going to start off with the sort of high concept and some of what I call limiting fallacies for how we approach historical mechanical games and just sort of reconsidering that approach. We're going to move on to philosophy and theory, which is going to be a bit higher level. We're going to get a little exploding brain with that, but stay with me. I'm going to give you the mental framework that I built for game design and how to apply it. And then just a little brief touch on my own application of these principles and how it manifests in my own work. So let's get into it. So this is a take or sort of impetus that I've seen. So this is a take or impetus that I've seen pretty frequently in just sort of the discourse, right? Is have you played a game that made you cry? This is sort of like a rallying cry for making new, exciting, different games. And to me, I think this question is sort of loaded, where we're really asking, have you played a game that you reacted to or felt similar to a book, a movie, a different type of experience that you're more familiar with and have related to in a more familiar way. The real thing we want to ask here is, how do we make emotive games? How do we make games that have meaning, that have substance, that trigger you to feel as much as they, excite you through play? And usually the answer that I've seen is be more explicit. And by explicit, I don't mean like in content, I mean more on the page, right? Like more narrative focused, more realistic, more expansive or bigger, more technical, more literal. Stuff that really has very little to do with actually playing a game. And to me, this isn't how games work best. Now, I put an asterisk there because we're going to come back to all of that, and I'm not saying those are invalid approaches. But to me, what separates games from other media is the interactivity. That's where things get interesting. That's where things get weird. That's why you'd make one of these instead of a movie or a book or a poem or whatever. And that's a duplicate slide. So I think that loaded question, have you ever played a game that made you cry? We can ask better questions than that. And we can do more innovative, exciting things with our games than just sort of chase what we've seen before. And I have just sort of listed out here for you just some that I came up with that you could break that down into, where it's like, have you played a game that allowed you to mourn? Or have you played a game that allowed you to sacrifice or to forgive or to experience gratitude and so forth? And these are all emotions that happen within you as a result of action or as a result of reflection. And action and reflection are things that aren't possible elsewhere but in our medium. And there's kind of two operative bits to each of these, where the first is that allowed, right, or the let you. Games fundamentally are about providing space. They're not about projecting so much as letting, right? So I think emotive games, the first step to getting there is sort of letting go of that direct control and providing people spaces for that reflection and thought. The sort of operative bit after that is you. It's emotive games facilitate feeling. They don't try to force feeling. Within that space, we want to allow people the ability to reflect. And I think these are way better questions to ask ourselves as designers if we want to innovate than how do we replicate what we've seen in other medium. And just specifically, I think we waste a lot of time chasing film. We do so much to take away control, to take away action, to take away play. And it ends up holding us back. Now, these techniques, I don't think this frontier is like some like, oh man, like can we get there thing. There's games that do this on varying levels, and you wouldn't know to look for them based off of how they look. If you're playing random MAME games, random Commodore 64 games, they usually will have some weird twist that you can, pick up just by looking at it because of how simple the games are. And our exploration of the body of work that precedes us can be limited by our attitude, by assuming that these games are silly or simple or primitive or whatever, just by face value. And I think it's also related to how we popularly talk about, play, and even make games. If you think about like a review you might have read or like treatises or whatever, we look at games as sort of a composite, right? Where we have these separate elements that boil down effectively to 3 bits. The part you play, the narrative, and the presentation, right? And breaking that down further, the part you play, this is what we usually refer to as the game's design. It's a distinct element. It's the core of the game, right? Even in game design documents or in pitches, sometimes you'll see like core gameplay as like sort of the main marquee piece of the game. And at scale, at least, let's say like AAA, notable indies, games you might have actually, commonly played. This really just needs to be engaging or stimulating and pull you forward for the narrative. But this is where we'll allow more meaning, if there is one. We'll engage with it more intellectually on this bit. We'll ponder subtext and intent. We'll do discourse. We dress all of this up with presentation, which effectively is the paint job, right? It's the art, the music, and everything surrounding the game. And we only really focus on that, which, again, being very cynical here, but is for differentiation or general interest. This compartmentalization trivializes the act of design. Emotive games are not a composition to me, but a synthesis. You shouldn't have multiple layered separate things. It should be one new thing as the result of those working in harmony. And we don't see a lot of this sort of compartmentalization in older games, I would say. And by older, I mean, let's say 15, 20 years out. They didn't have that luxury because there was so little they could put on the page for both design, technical, just artistic know-how reasons. More often than not, they had to use every bit and byte they were allowed to get that punch out of the game. So with the high concept behind us, we can get into what I call the limiting fallacies surrounding games. So the first is video games are a developing or young medium. Technically true, I will give you that. Chronologically, they're young. They spawned within the last 100 years or so. Let's say 1940s, you could trace it back if you want to go all the way to the first recognizable video game. But they were incepted during the largest technological and popular art boom in human history. And those artists were contemporary with that happening. The artists working in the new medium had access to the largest body of work we've ever seen and applied those fundamentals to video games. In effect, video games got sort of a kickstart from movies, industrial design, fashion, and all the other contemporary movements happening at the time. And if we want to go even a step more abstract, mechanical game design has existed for as long as our lobes in our brain, right? This is just the latest expression of game playing. If we take this all the way to heart, this fallacy trivializes the body of work that we have to study, and that limits our ability to learn from people who came before us. So related to that is the fallacy that old games are primitive. And again, technically true. There's less on the page when you play an old NES game or a Commodore 64 game than if you play something on the Xbox, Xbox One or whatever, the Xbox One S, X, whatever they're doing these days. But lack of hindsight fosters critical engagement. When you're doing something new for the first time, you have, and they still have goals and concepts as artists, right? And they engage critically to achieve those goals. We can assume that there's intent that we could pull from there and learn if we see something effective in that game. And that limitation came with clarity. Because, again, there's little to be distracted by when all you have is the game, some rudimentary presentation thereof, and that's that. Artists working in these times were trained in other fields often. Like famously, Shigeru Miyamoto was trained as a industrial designer before he entered video games, and he applied that knowledge to video games. Now, he was making some of the first bigger games that you would recognize, like Donkey Kong, but it was rooted in older knowledge. And again, just older games tend to be a bit more holistic in their approach, where they're using everything at their disposal for one common goal. Taken to heart, this fallacy trivializes the body of work as well. So this one as well, fun is a low aim. You see this sometimes in more like academic circles in game design, I would say. But I want to start with saying I understand the urge, right? As artists, we all want to do something new. We all want to do something you haven't seen before, and especially younger artists, you want to buck back, right? Like you want to do what hasn't been seen. That's valid, and I'm not saying that every game needs to be some highfalutin thing. But on the flip side of that token, by default, we engage with games slightly differently than we do other mediums. When you go to a game, you want to experience, and I'm going to use this word a little nebulously, pleasurable action, right? Like you do want to do something you enjoy doing. The act should lend itself to continuing the act, or else why would you engage in this artifice, right? Beyond that, fun is kind of a nebulous catch-all for a bunch of different concepts that we will encounter in game design. It's not necessarily always making a crowd pleaser. You could even look at fun as sort of a symptom of a game that's functioning, right? If you enjoy playing the game, it's like the drinkability of a beer. You want to take the next sip. And our brains, biologically, as animals, we're wired to pursue pleasure and avoid pain in most cases. This is, when we're tapping into that facility to do something artificial, we do have to make affordances for that, I would say. And just personally, I think fun does a lot of good in this world. I think there's people who are down and out and maybe just need a good time and can't, literally or metaphorically afford to engage with something artificial that is mentally draining. Been there myself. can speak from first person experience. Taken to heart, I think this, again, trivializes the body of work and limits the reach of our ideas, because accessibility is effectively how far your idea will go. And at the end of the day, you want people to want to play your game, right? So unless it's within your game's design to be player hostile, there's an element of seeking fun that you will most likely want to follow. And then just personal gripe that fun games are often too absurd to take seriously. So is life. Get over it. I would say in general, we have far less respect for our classics and body of work than artists in any other media. I work with a lot of musicians, and every musician I know is to some degree a music head, right? Every filmmaker I've ever met is enamored with film, even if they don't like the current state of the industry. People study those who came before them, even if they want to do something drastically different. And this stunts our growth, and there is so much more to learn from the games of the past. So that finishes that section. That takes us to philosophy and theory. So now we're going to get a little abstract. I'm going to use a lot of weird metaphors. Just bear with me. We're going to start with definitions, decoupling, and rebuilding. Just get us on the same page. So to me, loosely, a game can be defined as an interactive system of objects, which we'll call nouns, and connecting relations, verbs, possible between them. And that connected graph is going to be navigated by a player through the act of play. Objects can be literally anything, and the relations between them are the paths that we walk through play. So in this example, we have an object of a person that's directly controlled by the player's will. Let's say there's a car. The player can drive the car. The car can hit the player. There's a dog. You can pet the dog. The dog can lick you. And this describes a system. We can traverse this graph in the ways described here. That's the game. Play itself is active motion through the system, usually to achieve some objective and bring the system to some ending state. Here we see the player's will over time, just sort of reducing the number of whatever objects here that we don't care about at the time to reach the end state of the game. The root of mechanical expression and appreciation is concerning ourselves more with the relations between the objects than the objects themselves. If we concern ourselves too much with framing at the wrong times, we can limit our understanding of what's going on psychologically within a video game or any game. And before I go on from that slide, framing does matter. We will get back to this. Objects matter. But I think the crux of this argument is we want to pay attention to the doing. We want to pay attention to the how. So simple case study here is fighting game genre. We're going to construct the simplest fighting game that there is. Players have a finite amount of time to reduce each other's health down to 0. Hang on. So there's 3 objects in this system. There's 2 objects in the system. There's a timer in each player. You can call it 3 if you want to count each player as separate. And there's various methods of varying difficulty of execution, draining the other player's health. There's a win condition that the other player is out of health, so that's what we're navigating for within this graph. And only one player may win truly. Unless there's a timeout or a draw, this is a suboptimal outcome, and usually we want to avoid this. So if we represent this in sort of the simple nomenclature from before, we have 2 different varying wills, and we're effectively enacting directly upon each other to enact what our preferred outcome is on the system. On a surface level, this describes a physical fight because that's normally how we set dress it. But if we look at the relations between the objects within this system, it's really just dominance-based dominance-based conflict resolution. And if you think about your mind state when you play a fighting game, if you think about how players talk to each other during a match, if you think about the sorts of thoughts and feelings you have during a match, how your body responds when it gets tense and down to the wire, how you feel after winning or how you feel after losing, I think you'll find similarities between if you've ever had a bit of a hot conflict with somebody. And this is the result of effective emotive mechanical design. Now, granted, this is applied to a very simple case, but this is effective, I would say. But if we want to change those thoughts and reactions, we change the system. And even in a genre, usually unconcerned with explicit meaning, there's a truthful experience conveyed here. If you've been in one of those arguments, you've felt those same feelings. You've felt that tension. You've changed your voice, you've reacted because of what's going on within you because of external stimuli. And when we look at it through this viewpoint, we're empowered to leverage the traditional for higher purposes. So returning to our case study, what if we just slightly tweaked the relations within our system? What if there were repercussions for winning traditionally winning? What if it was a race to the bottom instead of a race to the top? What if both players could win? What if the timer couldn't enact upon the players? How do these changes affect player behavior is what we want to think about as a game designer creating new systems. How does engaging in those behaviors affect the mind state while playing the game? Before any dressing, visuals, narrative, audio, whatever. With minute changes to relations, we can create an experientially different game. With that dressing, we could push this even further and create something that's wholly, maybe unrecognizable as a fighting game with the same tenets. So if we strip off visuals, audio, narrative, we're left with rules that say something on their own, even in the basic case. If we could do this with a bare bones example of a simple genre, what else could we apply this thinking to? Without the shackles of genre, if we completely start from scratch with those pushes and pulls and structures, how far could you go? That's the frontier. So at a glance, to me, stepping a little bit further back, design is form meeting function, regardless of medium, right? If we interpret what we want to convey as the function of the game, what's going to define our game's shape? And keeping it a little abstract, it's not a distinct element of a game, the design. True design, to me, can't be compartmentalized because every element of a work is going to tint the experience. The game designs, we discuss it in the sort of nuclear model of like we have the game design at the core, we have the story outside of that, we have the presentation on top of that. It limits us to seeing the game as this sum of parts, and it separates all the elements from each other. So if we want a more holistic approach to game design, how can we define that? So looking at the current model, we have sort of design at the nucleus, we have like a story, presentation on the outside is like a paint job. It's compartmentalized, this is layered, this is composite. All of these things are sort of sitting next to each other, creating something new, but not necessarily integrated. And it would be very easy to compartmentalize this workflow-wise as well, which is, I think, one of the reasons it's so tantalizing to look at games this way. The way I sort of conceptualize video games is more of a helixical woven braid, right? A creation of one new whole from higher level elements, synthesizing a new experience. If you've done your job correctly as a holistic game designer, there's one new thing at the end of it, not just a collection of parts. The braid allows us to engage with all aspects of the game as designers rather than just owning our own turf. We're not just going to have some system sitting at the inside of the game and then have someone else paint it and then have someone else soundtrack it and then whatever. We're integrating all of this into our overall high-level vision and using it to our own ends. This is the holistic approach. So I break the braid down into 4 separate threads. At a lower level, any game design can be broken down to these pillars. We have the action, and we'll get to these terms, inductive and conductive, in a moment. But we have the action, the fantasy, the aesthetic, and the message. This may be a little spicy, but to me, this list is ordered in precedence. And I say that because action, regardless of genre, what you do and how you do it is what defines a game. You can't have a game without acting. You can't have a game without message. You can't have a game without fantasy, without aesthetic. So at the top here, I would say we want to concern ourselves first with what we are doing when we go to design a new game. So drilling down just a little bit, expressive mechanical design is based on the induction of verb emotions through systemic elements. Through the other elements, we conduct noun emotions. This harmony can result in experiences impossible in other mediums. So drilling into that a little bit, I like to make the delineation between sort of verb emotions and noun emotions. Verb emotions happen to you and within you. They're usually a result of reflection and sense. They're more about empathy. They're more about embodying and feeling it in the moment. And they're more about how. Noun emotions happen sort of around you, right? Like they're more about understanding your situation that you find yourself within. They're more about sympathy. They're rooted in watching. They're rooted more in the what of the circumstance. And these are both I'm not saying verb emotions are more valid to pursue in a video game than noun emotions. What I'm saying is we have access to this whole other column of the human experience that is very hard to find in other artworks. If we compare this to like sort of electrical current, right? Generally, I would say verbs, the verb end of the games, are inductive and nouns are conductive. Verbs and doing things are more likely to result in feelings on that left side of the column. Nouns are more conductive to feeling things on the right side of the column. And these are sort of two different strategies you can think about while you're designing your game, where when you want to induct an emotion, the artist will be passive in the moment and the player is active. We construct spaces to allow freedom within those spaces and surrender some control over outcome. This allows the player to derive meaning through wandering through an area and a possibility space themselves. Conduction is sort of the other end of the coin, where the artist is active in the moment and the viewer is passive. We construct specifics to guide the player along an architected path, leading to a or many specific desired outcomes, and meaning is usually derived by following through a line. And what you'll notice here is the left side is all about what the other end of this transaction is doing. The right side is about what you're doing. The right side is what you would encounter in a film. The left side is what you encounter in, let's say, a pure game like Pong. And these are, I wouldn't say, are different schools of thought. These are techniques that are available to us as game designers because we can lean into linear forms and sort of ebb and flow between these. There's a time and place for both, and most successful games, I would say, employ both of these. So going back a bit more abstract is the concept of mental architecture. This is just sort of the way I view the process of creating a new video game or any game of any sort, where if games are metaphorical spaces and rule sets define subspaces and structures, the confines of a game can be described in the terms of architecture. So if we have the set of all possible games that we could make, our specific game is only going to subtend a certain amount of those possibilities within our own possibility space. The rooms here are the possibilities we allow. The walls and bounds are the constraints we impose on that freedom. So that would be either through rules or through presentation, through flow control, whatever levers we have access to. Novel constraints beget novel games. Your game, if you're doing something truly new, will be shaped mentally different than someone else's game. And using pushes and pulls, we can guide thought during play. Right, so one of the easiest is if we have a desired outcome for the player and we have an undesirable outcome at another end or whatever, we can predict as designers what they most likely will do and define sets of spaces where we can architect what they should be thinking or feeling in a moment. And this sort of mental walking meditation of the mind is the domain of action. And by action, I just mean doing. I don't mean action like genre. I don't mean action like whatever sort of trappings we would associate with that. I mean verbs. And that's a domain all of our own. You don't have access to that in any other medium, and that's powerful. So breaking down the braid itself. So most importantly, or I guess at most rudimentally, we have the action. At a high level, this is what we do in the game. What decisions do we allow the player to make? What freedoms do we allow the player? What constraints do we allow in that freedom? And what is the pacing of this action? On a low level, it's how do we do what we do in this game? It's input, haptics, whatever sort of feedback there. Before we get into any presentation of that feedback, because we'll get into that a little later. But generally, the action is the description of what we spend our time doing while playing. If I hand you the controller, what do you expect your hands to do, and what do you expect your mind to tell it? This is where we spend most of our time as game designers traditionally, regardless of mental model. And this is firmly within that domain. If we want to compose meaningful action, though, I think these are the essentials that need to be in every single game. I don't care what genre you're working in or what framework you're using. Players need impetus to act or decide not to. They need freedom and some capacity to choose, whatever that means within your system. There needs to be constraint. Limitation creates impetus and facilitates, didn't finish that slide, but whatever. Context. There must be clear delineation between action and inaction, and consequence. Decisions must have weight. This creates a sense of possibility. Each of these may be employed systemically or explicitly, so you can either do this like with your content or with your actual, again, traditionally game design. But what really matters is that this is perceived. Every single one of these elements must at least have the illusion of being present for play to happen. Otherwise, your players will go through the motion or make arbitrary choices, make correct decisions, and generally not be in the moment. This is what I like to call the power tools, though. There's varying ways you can structure a game that allow you to get more explicit with your messaging. And the three main ones that I've outlined that I like to fall back to are allegory, which is creating parallels between player choices and larger ideas, because this invites reflection outside of the game and relates it back to real life. This is a great way to talk about feelings. This is a great way to talk about the ephemeral. It's a very poetic way to create a game structure. There's abstraction, which is reducing complex systems of ideas to their essentials. And this allows accessible engagement with difficult topics. And I think a great example here would be city builders as a means of political messaging, for example. And then there's pantomime, which is facilitating systemic role play of a real world experience, going through the motions to feel what was felt. These formula further our ability to design rule structures with their own weight and their own meaning. So just a few questions to ask yourself if you wanted to employ this model. Of any given life moment or experience or thought or whatever you may have, ask yourself, what were the driving forces behind this to get the context? What was happening to you at that time to give you context and constraint? What could and couldn't you do to give you freedom and constraint? How did your actions make you feel? What you did yourself? Why did it make you feel that way? And that gives you impetus and consequence. How did the actions of others or the circumstances you found yourself in make you feel? Again, impetus, consequence. And what was the consequence of your varying actions, which will inform you the sort of outcomes of your system. When you answer these questions honestly, it helps you break down not only what you were experiencing, but why you were experiencing it. And when you understand that line you went through, maybe you can construct a space that allows someone else to land in a similar area that you were, and now you can start expressing. Before we've even done anything visual to the game, I might add. So now we can move on to the fantasy. The fantasy, its job is to tickle the imagination and to create a sense of purpose and involvement. Generally, if you just present like a raw game to somebody, it's kind of hard to care unless they've played it and have felt, how fun or engaging or whatever it is. The fantasy is what gets you hooked. The fantasy is what makes you care. So you want to think to yourself, what urge does your game satisfy? What wish are you fulfilling? What dream does the player get to live? What other life do they get to live momentarily here? This is the why of engaging with your system. Fantasy creates that buy-in, it drives you to act, and facilitates richer and higher level emergent narrative. So when I'm playing your game and going through that mental walking meditation, this provides context where I can sort of think about it as more than just what happened and why. The next sort of thread being the aesthetic. This is the overall how of the game. This can be thought of similarly to presentation. It's tied tightly with fantasy, but it is a distinct element. And the aesthetic is kind of broadly defined, I would say, because there's so much that goes into the perception of your game. There's the look and feel that we would traditionally think about as visual presentation and design. There's also audio presentation and design, UX decision-making, haptics and input mapping, generally how your game will be perceived. Framing and meta presentation, where, like, for example, camera direction, rule set manifestation, right? Like genre convention, right? If I'm going to do a first-person camera versus a third-person camera, that's a game design decision as much as it is a visual distinction. Fundamentally, there's games that will work from many different vantages, and the one you choose will tint the experience. And explicit narrative partially resides here. Your plot and setting will make people reconsider their actions and the weight thereof, just based off of that extra framing work. Like, a realistic shooter will hit differently than Doom, right? And that's why aesthetic is an important pillar, because it tints your experience. And I say tints rather than coats, because this should be deeply woven into your game. It determines how all other elements are perceived. This can and should be a load-bearing first-party element of your design. When you integrate aesthetics, it's kind of like seasoning food, right? If you do it well, it's a integral component, elevating all the other elements and enhancing the overall experience. In some cases, with food even, there's times where spices can be the defining element of a dish, right? But when you do it haphazardly, it's just more flavors on the plate, right? So as a holistic designer, you want to consider this as deeply as you do your rules, because it's the manifestation of your game. And then there's the message, what we intend to convey with our game. In this context, I'm referring explicitly to the elements on the page rather than what we're pursuing with the game. So conveying explicit plot, conveying explicit personal story, political messaging, that sort of stuff. This is where we spend most of our time as writers, right? If we were looking at it in a separate context. I feel like doing this explicitly right now is kind of in vogue, especially with the indie space. We'll have stuff that on the surface level will wear the message on the sleeve. And I'm going to couch this by saying this is all valid and important. But when the other threads of your game are well woven, a sense of the message arises organically. If your verbs are in concert with your aesthetic and are in concert with your fantasy, often you'll have an emergent message that can be perceived through the actual doing of your game. This may even happen unintentionally as a byproduct of just the process of making your game, where your own views will manifest into your work. So to me, message can manifest in three substantial ways, where you have sort of an invisible hand driving the creative process, or with palpable or visual elements contained within other threads, or explicitly stated. To me, the above is listed in order of efficacy. I think when you have that well-woven braid, you're going to hit people much deeper than you would if you just told them what you mean. So then this concept of weaving, right? It's making sure every facet of your game is tightly coupled. And you can do this pairwise, you can do this all around, whatever. But generally, you want to ask yourself how the intertwined parts of your game can be tied together and how they can be tied tighter. The one example I see popularly is sort of ludonarrative dissonance, right? Where we talk a lot about that one in specific, but I think there's a larger sort of conversation of why are various elements of your design not talking to each other? Some example here are we have, does your action provide ample space for aesthetic and fantasy and message to arise? Can your fantasy elevate your actions? Do your actions and message align? And there we go, ludonarrative dissonance or harmony. And does your aesthetic heighten your action, your fantasy, your message, so on? You can ask this of any pair of braids here, and it'll give you another insight into what's going on with your design. Through this lens, we can more tightly couple every aspect of our game into a whole that's more potent, concise, and singular. And the whole crux of this argument here with holistic game design is it should play like it means, like it looks, like it sounds, like it feels. It should be one experience going through your game, not a collection of separate elements. So just briefly touching on my own practice and how I put my money where my mouth is here. I'm going to talk about two games that I've made, separated by, I believe, 5 years. This is one of the first games I've actually released, NEO1. And I made this game during a really hard time in my life. And it was about that experience. And I didn't want to make something just directly, it's Ethan Red in the game, right? So I wove it together as follows, right? You have the action based around putting yourself back together, literally. You're playing as a robot in a light sci-fi setting who has lost his parts for varying reasons because plot. Through the gameplay, you find your parts, gain new functionality and access to a ship that can get you off of this planet, eventually allowing you to resolve the conflict. It starts off as a walking simulator and reveals itself to be more of a Metroidvania over time. And all of this is tied to the message. We'll get into it in a minute. But the play of this game is the narrative. There's very little explicit story in this game beyond the first, I believe, 30 seconds to 2 minutes. Fantasy. So I used a light sci-fi setting to avoid just making a sob story about myself. You're a broken robot with a dying battery jettisoned on an uninhabited planet. Right when you find a nice place to power off, you find a ship and a skeleton of the man who tried to build it. And I do some characterization where the planet is not poisonous to the robot. They do nothing but cute dialogue here. aesthetic, this is woven to the fantasy. It's a first-person game to further immersion and sympathy. There's vibrant pastel colors, there's giant flowers invoking specific meaning and making you feel small. There's gentle music, there's a childlike atmosphere to make you more receptive to this character. Increasingly, the game becomes more fun to interact with as you progress. As you sort of shake off this sort of depressive mindset or whatever, the controls start off clunky and limited and then loosen up and add options to the game as it progresses, which is tied to the action of the game. You start off with no abilities, and by the end, you're playing it like it's any other action game. And the message was heavy-handed and implicit. Hard things will happen to you in life, and with time, determination, and a little outside help, you can put yourself back together again and get where you're going. I never directly say this sort of stuff in the game, but people who have played this game have told me that they've been touched by going through the experience. And it's the going through of the game was the point of it. And the last being, well, my other GIF isn't loading. But yeah, the last being Killer Auto, which is one of my recent games. We're actually working on this currently. And this is a very different animal. Killer Auto on the surface looks like, a fun, high-octane racing game, and it is. You can play it just for that. But Killer Auto on a deeper level means a lot to me, personally. And I can't really talk about the design of Killer Auto without talking about my life a bit. So to get literally to this stage, literally and metaphorically, it took a lot of doing for me over the past over a decade, right? There were times where I was, sleeping on floors. There's times where I slept in cars. There was a time when my second GDC talk, I actually couldn't afford to get out there, and the organizers had to help me with the flight. And I ate 5 times that entire week, not 5 times, not 5 meals. And I've been through a lot, right? And without giving you my whole sob story, Killer Auto is about leaning in. Killer Auto's rule set is all based along a vicious feedback loop, where the harder you drive, the faster you go. The more danger you put yourself in, the more you can milk out of the car. The person who is willing to lean in the furthest is going to get the most out of this game. This game has a test of skill, but it's really a test of attitude. And the reason I structured it like that is because when you're ripping through this game at a lethal 200 miles per hour and trying to figure out how to make it 300 and then 400, when you're throwing yourself at everything you can because you want more, because you want to win, for a brief moment, even if you don't realize it, you're feeling how I felt trying to make these games, trying to get my dreams to come true. And then maybe when you put the controller down, you can remember that feeling. And that's why I make video games. It's a really powerful way to put somebody in an embodied moment. And we can do so much with our works. And yeah, that's my talk. Oh, yeah.
Hello. Great. Thank you so much, Ethan, for it was such a cerebral talk that got me thinking about a lot about my own practice, but also about the ways in which I kind of play games. Yeah, and I had a bunch of questions for you, I think, because the way that I've come to your work was mostly from these kind of GIFs that you've shared on Twitter. I've been a kind of big fan of your art direction for games, and also I think the speed at which a lot of your games work, and the kind of the physicality of it. So I had a lot of questions about that, and also because I think a lot of our students are currently in midterms, and in a particular point in which they have to kind of go all in on a direction, right? Whether that's visual or for a vision or any kind of like that. So I was gonna ask some questions about that. But I think I want to lead mostly with I think some of the hot takes that you've made in this talk. Yeah. First of which I think is I think there was a point that you made. I think, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think the kind of the crux of this talk is about taking games a little bit way too seriously, or maybe not in the sense of or reading too much into it, right? I think there was a moment when you talked about this is the kind of popular critical take on games, where it's oh, let's just break it down into what are the mechanics and what are the kind of stories, and then what is the kind of packaging of the whole thing. what you're kind of allowing us to think about and also encouraging us to think about is, what if what seems like just the action of a game is also touching on sort of the emotionality and like developer storytelling. So I think there's like I also say this as well, but there's a kind of class difference between the critic and the artist, right? There's like what the artist intends in the thing that they make, and what the critic is able to kind of take away from it. What kind of focus are they going to write about? And I think the fun element, which you talked about, is a interesting thing because it's hard to design for and also describe. But I think the point of fun mostly being like it has to be interesting enough for you to stay in there and then unpack the other good parts, right? That the artist has intended. But I think because we're also in a school where we have to think really seriously about games that are meant to be just generally fun or lightweight, and I think I also, as a sort of, a younger person playing games, was always afraid that I was being overly serious about a game or something like that. Did you ever have a game that you were like, maybe I'm taking this a little bit too seriously, or like I'm reading too much into it as a player or a critic, that maybe the artist did not intend?
So this is a funny question for me in particular because like I wrote my entry essay to NYU on Sonic 3 and Knuckles. So there is no too serious for me.
Oh, sure.
Yeah. I don't know. I think serious is good. I think being critical is good. I think if you're an artist, you should care deeply and you should break things down as far as you feel like they need to go. I don't think there is a line where, unless it, I guess, perverts the meaning of the work, where if it gets in the way, like you're playing Katamari Damacy and not giggling, like you're not really experiencing it.
Right.
But I think when you're in that sort of critical lane, it's good to have that focus. Sure,
yeah. And I think another kind of the hot take that I've seen was just your kind of, encouragement of, I guess, new designers as well, basically to be like, hey, go look back into the kind of classics, right, and kind of what they're doing. And don't brush it off as like something that has happened, really early in the history of games and therefore kind of burdened by technical limits or whatever. But I do think there's also something that we can't ignore about classic games, which is like the context around it, right? And like, that kind of cultural point in the history. I think at that time, games as a commercial object were kind of burdened by marketing around it and like the audience of it. But do you have like a trick maybe that you can impart about like how to play a game without the context around it, or like a cold play of a game? It's so hard, especially nowadays, because it's like so many games you come to with the discourse around it and having heard a lot of it. But you're encouraging designers to be like, go back to the classics and play them, see what they're exactly doing without some of the cultural context that they entail. Do you have like a trick for that? Do you ever play a game making sure that like you don't, engage with the
don't do the meta engagement. Yeah. I think the easiest solution there is to play different games. I think if you, and I use classics really broadly here because there's in every medium a bunch of just sort of like mid classics, I would say, where there's the stuff that fills up a genre that isn't necessarily the one we're going to remember in like 150 years, right? Like if I say platformer, you're thinking Mega Man, you're thinking, Mario, you're thinking Sonic, I don't know, like, what's the one that everyone memes, Gek or whatever, the lizard, there's, but there's so many more games out there. Like if I say, you should go play Turrican, you know what I mean? Random Commodore 64 game, you have no idea what it is. Turrican 3, by the way, like is one of the most effective Ludo narrative harmony moments I've seen in any video game halfway through. But just like playing random games. Honestly, like I'm not encouraging piracy here, but if you play it through the MAME catalog, like you would learn so much about experimental game design because those guys were trying weird stuff on the arcades. And nobody's going to talk about like a random game in like the S category from like 1979. There's games like pre-visuals where you can just learn so much about systemics just because they had nothing else, Yeah, I think getting off the beaten path, playing really widely, or even if you don't want to play, like go on YouTube, watch console mixes. Like there's people who cut together mixes of entire consoles libraries for some reason. You get like 30 seconds of gameplay, and you can sample extremely widely very quickly and see what the diversity of thought there was. I guess to more directly answer, going into a game with a lot of discourse, I don't think there's an easy way around that. You just have to go in with an open mind. You have to make the decision that I'm playing this for myself. Like recently I got into the Yakuza games, and it's mainly because Twitter sings their praises all the time, right? Like everybody loves Yakuza. And going into it, I just had to make sure that I'm just gonna listen to the game. I'm gonna look at what's on the screen. I'm gonna pay attention to what my hands are doing. I'm gonna think about where I'm being pushed and pulled. And just think for yourself, really.
Yeah, sure, yeah. I think it's just because, like, I think to be kind of a game head the way like a music head or a film head would operate, where it's like holding some kind of reverence for these early games because they were influential or they were kind of pioneering at that time. I think it holds a very different kind of meaning in games as well because of its history, and we can't really divorce it from that. But I do agree, and I think it's kind of different coming from you as opposed to someone who maybe lived that time, which could come off a little boomery, being like, you gotta play whatever.
The interesting thing there too is
Yeah.
talking about influence. I think there's a lot to learn from games that had very little influence. I think we spend a lot of time talking about the bangers, right? Like we're thinking
That's
about the
what I'm
ones,
saying,
like the ones we're gonna remember in 150 years.
Yeah.
But there's so many failed, mediocre, or even just forgotten games that have a really good idea in them that you could learn from. The same way, like if you just go listen to random funk vinyls as a musician, there might be that one hook where it's like, that was genius, but the rest of this album is mid, you know? I think just playing really widely if you can. If you can't, because like, you know, growing up, I didn't have consoles, so like I sampled ROMs and stuff. But if you can't play widely, just like read, you know, and then develop that internal sort of simulator where you can see a structure of rules and think, this is how a player most likely would act. This is how I most likely would feel at that moment. And then just like ingest a lot, like really just take everything in.
Nice, yeah. And I think another of the hot takes I wanted to ask you about, which I agree with, mostly because I think I also operate in the same way where like at the foundation of games there is the kind of action or the kind of the verb that you're talking about. But the thing that you've kind of ordered it in such a way where like the final thing is the message, right? And is, you know, the way that you described it was like it was the least important or something that could be ultimately decided to be included or not. Because if in definition, action should also serve that, right? But I kind of agree with that, but do you feel like a game could operate, you know, with the message as like a foundation and then like other of these threads kind of working around it? Or do you think that's impossible and message is more sort of the explicit explanation of the other parts?
Right, so this is something I kind of wanted to expand on there, but just kind of ran out of time. But any one of those threads can be the crux of your game.
Yeah.
You can be a visual artist, for example, and mainly want to make a game that just looks awesome. And as long as you're supporting it and coupling it with everything else, that's a valid urge to me. You can't have a game where it's like, I explicitly want to make this game because of some, you know, political drive or whatever. And if you structure everything else such that it supports that and is coupled and isn't just sitting next to it, that can be rad as hell too. Like I think all of these can stand on their own. More specifically about the importance of message. So that list is structured more in order of like existential importance, right? Like I think you just cannot play a game without action because fundamentally you play games. After that, fantasy is most likely going to get people playing your games. If, you know, like playing tag versus playing like freeze tag. Kids, I think, would be more excited about freeze tag, right? Or tag versus Nerf guns. You know what I mean? Like there's a layer of something that's like, oh, now I'm playing and I'm imagining. And then aesthetic, especially once we enter the land of the physical and we're no longer just playing with our bodies or whatever, there's presentation, you know, that's what's going to get someone more invested in your game. Message as an explicit element, I think is the least important. message as impetus for why you're making the thing and how you do this twisting, or message as an end resolve of the other threads coming together, those I think are essential.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, I guess on that note, I will kind of lead into the questions that I've kind of prepared, which is about kind of the visual style of your work, which we saw a little bit of in the beginning and also in the latter parts. But I think this also ties into your the third of that thread, which is the aesthetic, right? Which is you kind of described as like spicing the food, where it's like if done well, it's integral. But if done badly, it's just flavor that's just like messing up the senses a little bit or adding too much into it. But yeah, I want to ask your opinion on the kind of stylization, choosing a style for a game or something like that. I believe, and also I think I teach our students that it's much more harder to find, like stylize a game in a certain way that's kind of abstract or illustrative, and never too illusionistic. I think photorealistic style is something that's the easiest to, maybe not technically, but conceptually easiest to implement.
Technically,
Sure.
It's like cutting with the grain these days because everything's using the same
Yeah.
workflows and the artists are all trained in a standard way. It makes sense as like a production decision almost to lean into that by default.
100%. And also, yeah, I think like, maybe this is a rude question, but did you ever choose like a style for a game and wonder if that was like the right decision? Like, did you ever, was it really like a very clear decision when you choose like a style for a game that this fits everything else, every other part of this game? Or did you ever go like, is this the right one? Or like, maybe this is too much work for the kind of reward that I'll get as a designer. Does it ever feel like, do you ever feel unsure about that? Or is it just like, oh no, of course?
Yeah, so I think style isn't something you choose so much as style should choose you. I think if you have something you're trying to say, or if you have specific influences you're excited about, or if you have, it should be specific to your game. Like once you've decided on what the like heart and soul of your game is, that has a color, like metaphorically, that has a sound, that has its own signature. And I think if you're choosing a style as a conscious step, I think you maybe don't understand your game yet, or maybe don't understand yourself yet, or anywhere in between that, where there's something that you don't know you need to say yet,
Fair, yeah.
And there's times, like, for example, realism, I think, is totally a valid default choice if you're making a production decision. I think it's a totally valid default choice if you're conveying a sort of explicitly grounded idea where that will, structurally serve the game. But in terms of choosing, and I imagine we're talking mainly visual style here.
Yes, yeah.
But this applies to audio too, and I think that's something people don't really think about a lot these days. You want to have it exacerbate everything else about the game. Like Killer Auto would not land if it was realistic. First, how are those cars flying? You know what I mean? Like, why are they flying? Like it would look stupid. The fact that it looks like a cartoon opens your brain up a little bit to it. Oh well, this isn't real already. I can accept that. And there's a bunch of decisions along that line. Even when working with like my sound designer, there will be times where I'm like, that sound needs to be goofy as hell. Like that needs to sound like Looney Tunes for this to work. And there's other times it's like the foot squeaks, for example, need to sound like wood, or people aren't going to feel like they're stepping for our sports game. And everything should be a conscious decision, I think, is sort of my main thing here. If you're doing anything by default, and if you're doing anything rote, I think it's the same pitfall if you don't really know what you want to say yet.
Yeah, but I mean, I think speaking of influences as well, I think you're also pulling like very specific pulls aesthetically from particular. The word that I use in class is like pastiching, which is basically harkening back to a period or like a movement in our history, or referencing or making an homage to like a very particular art style. And I think there's a bit of that definitely in your current work. And I don't know, I think some of our students are also have this kind of not fear, but like they're kind of reticent to be like, they don't really love it when people say like, look at their game and they're like, this looks like something.
Yeah.
Right?
That's not going to go away.
Yeah, I'm sure. I think we've all experienced that where it's like, oh yeah, this looks like a GameCube era game or a PS2 era game. I think there's definitely, it's intentionally done sometimes, right? To remind us of like that period of gaming when the possibility space of a game was like unsure. Right? I think the kind of PS2, PS1 era horror genre is like a real vogue thing in indie spaces right now, because at that time, like software, we don't know how it really worked as players, right? So like the spookiness of the idea of like putting in a disc in and like not knowing what's gonna happen, I think that's what that's kind of alluding to.
That and the tech itself was so mushy. Like the way
100%, yeah.
the PS1 processes polygons is non-deterministic.
Yeah, and it's so scary. So because you're like, I don't know if that's a face or...
Yeah, it lends itself really well to horror because it feels like the world around you is melting, right?
100%,
like,
yeah.
Like you can't trust anything.
But yeah, if you could talk a little bit about maybe your work in pastiching a little bit, maybe some of the influence that you've taken and how you feel about that, how you feel when, audiences of your game, one, expect that maybe from Virtuoso Neomedia going forward, and to have a certain kind of assumption about what kind of games you're making with that style.
Right. Okay, so multiple facets there. As far as the feeling goes, if people compare me to something they love, I take it as a compliment, or at least I try to. It gets annoying when a game that has nothing to do with cars gets compared to F-Zero because it's fast. But, like they loved F-Zero and they seemingly are going to love this thing, so I'll take it. As far as pastiching itself goes, personally, I'm not a fan of directly leaning into nostalgia. I feel like there's a difference between being inspired by the same things and landing the same place and researching roots and doing the homework versus now I'm going to make my GameCube game,
Yeah.
Like my brother and I, we do a lot of study of like woodblock paintings for low poly to get like certain silhouettes. We look into cartoons. Like one of our biggest inspirations this last year has been like the Chuck Jones era of cartoons for, I believe it was Looney Tunes. Just amazing visual design. We pull from a lot of different areas and then we manifest it through low poly work. And we're going to sort of land in a similar space because they were trying to make their games look like cartoons and just technically couldn't do it. Now we're inspired by cartoons, and manpower-wise, we can't go further in the NPR direction, non-photorealistic render. So we're kind of operating in the same band, but I'm not necessarily like attached to, I want to make an accurate GameCube game. Like there's times where I'll be pushing 2 million tries, right? Just because of like effects and such, and like technically that would never happen. And there's times where we do stuff in Geo that should have been done in Alpha, according to them, just because they were working on a different technical basis. And like Zodiac XX, for example, I think is the most I've leaned directly into sort of like a retro 3D style in recent years. And that one pulls from many different eras of early 3D for the actual like visual design of the game. There's stuff on there that would be at home in a PS2, and there's other stuff where this is how they would have done it on a Saturn. And it's completely anachronistic. And people often place it in different eras because of the sort of mixing of these techniques. And I think that's cool. I think that's fun. Ultimately, I think if, it's valid to do, but I think it's more exciting if you pull from a variety of sources.
Yeah, and I think the way that you described it, where it's like, it's kind of the same band, I think is a real nice way to put it, right? Which is like, you're working under the same kind of value system as maybe some of those people, developers that you're being compared to had at that time, which is like, yes, we want to imitate those styles. We are limited by various means. So here are the kind of values we're going to keep. And you end up creating not similar music, but music with the same kind of philosophy and ethos, right, which is good.
That, and then there's also value, I think, in invoking iconography, too, where there's...
100%, yeah.
Sometimes because a thing is shaped a certain way or looks a certain way, people are going to accept it a certain way. So there's also that. Just time and place, I guess.
Yeah. I guess I have a final question about maybe the direction of like this new studio, which I just learned talking to you before the talk, is that it's like solid now as a studio, no longer just a sole proprietorship.
Yeah, it's not just me anymore.
Oh, just great. And also maybe a little bit about the kind of motto. I think it's like future forever.
Forward forever.
Forwards,
Yeah.
and I was like mixed because you also had a slide about kind of that futurist thinking of like, you know, the acceleration as a form. Yeah, but do you have any like solid, you know, ethos or the philosophy that you're, as a creative lead of that studio going forward in this game and some of the other ones that you've mentioned?
Right. Across all of my work, I want to make games that affirm the best in life and inspire the best out of people. And that's the underlying decision-making process in everything we do, both in how we work and what we make. We do the incredible so that way people can see it's done. We're pitching 3 games right now. We're pushing 3 games within 2 years. We're doing crazy stuff so that way people can see crazy stuff happens. You know, we make games about crazy things happening because we live in a world where crazy things can happen. We make games with incredible characters and people because we want to show people that they could be one too, you know? Just bold visions of the future is that's what I'm passionate about. When I was really young, like there was a time where like games were pretty much like all I really had in life, right? And I want to give that back to the people behind me. So, yeah.
All right. I think that's all from me, but maybe we can open it up to in-person audience and maybe Twitch. Let's start with the in-person audience. Does anyone want to ask a question for Ethan?
Hey, dude.
Hey, Chris.
Long time no see. I really like your slide where you split up a lot of sort of emotive actions in games into like this verb and noun emotions or these sort of inductive and conductive emotive qualities. I thought that was a really profound way to think about just emotion in general, like as a person, not necessarily as a player. But I also thought it was interesting how you connected these sort of conductive emotions or noun emotions to other forms of media, like film and books and whatnot. So it's very easy to see how like game makers can draw inspiration from that. Inductive or verb emotions, like, is there another media from which you can draw inspiration? How do you sort of build that out in your game, and how do you sort of develop that skill? Because that seems less obvious to me, seeing as it's something unique to games.
Right. I think in general, studying systems is how you get a feel for that. Any sort of system of thought, or like, for example, like learning about politics or learning about like computers or anything where there's rules and outcomes that are defined, you can sort of start thinking about second order consequence, and then applying that, I think, is studying psychology. And then on the other end, I would say is poetry. Recently I've been reading a ton of poetry, and I feel like it's a similar sort of feeling. I can't really articulate it yet, but I think the structure of poetry is like really useful in video game design.
Thanks, man.
Mm-hmm.
Hello. First off, I want to say thank you for coming. It was an amazing lecture. One of the things that really hit home for me was when you mentioned to kind of stray off the normal path and kind of really, really emphasize exploration to kind of help your overall design. And to a degree, I absolutely agree with that. I mean, if you're trying to enhance your design in general, regardless of any medium, I think exploration of what you're trying to do is absolutely amazing. And whether that stems from, physical or digital word of mouth, I think that's really interesting. And I guess this is more of a silly question, but for me, I do have some friends that are like very specific in the lane that they want to go to, where it's like, I only play like, FPS games, and I want to just make FPS games. But for me, I kind of want to be that person that allows them to experience other genres of games and like allow them to grab elements of those and sprinkle that into their games. So my question is, what do you do to those type of people or designers that kind of just have that like tunnel vision when it comes to like the design of the games that they want to make as well?
So I think, just to couch the rest of my opinion, I think it's totally valid to take that approach and just get really good at one thing. Like, they'll probably achieve a level of that design that's hard to match as a generalist. My counter argument there, though, is I think it makes you a better game designer to have strong fundamentals. And I think if you're working within the confines of a single genre, and especially a single digital genre, there's a lot of constraints you're imposing on yourself that are going to limit how you think about systems. And I think a more abstract knowledge of just dealing with systems will help you in whatever genre you're going to work in. So I would just say studying wider, like if you compare it to visual art, people who take the time to do figure drawing, who take the time to do constructions, who take the time to learn about value and depth, like who take the time to really develop the fundamentals, they can do stylization better, they can do real style better, they can do, just generally, they will be a more competent artist. So I think that's sort of the case for stepping out of your comfort zone every now and then. There's a ton of just sort of unfinished designs on my computer where I just try a genre just because there's times where I just make games that don't really fall in the genre and they just maybe don't work. And all that, you get a little nugget of wisdom from it. So I think it's stunting your growth if you don't try new things. And I think that's kind of just universal to like the human experience.
Thank you.
Hi, yeah. So I loved how you talked about, linking everything and meshing everything together. But I mean, when you're working on a team of people, especially when everyone sort of has a specialization, how do you keep everybody sort of, meshing together in that situation?
Right. Okay. So I remember I read this really old book when I was younger. I think it was by Eric Benth, and it was about the production of video games. But he had my favorite definition of a game designer, like their role in the team, where they're basically the listener in chief, right? You got to be able to speak everyone's tongue. You should be educated enough on all the different disciplines in making a game where you can have an educated conversation with the person about your high-level goals and empower them to achieve them. So like if you're working with musicians, you should know music theory to an extent. You know what I mean? You should be, well-versed in at least adjacent genres to what you're working with your game. So that way when you want to convey, I want this moment to do this, you're making sense to them, right? Like you should have enough knowledge of color theory or composition or whatever to talk to your visual artist in a language where they're going to be able to execute on what you want done. And then having really strong direction will take you far. I think the stronger your concept is and the more definite what you know, what you want to achieve is, the more you'll be able to communicate that to your team. So ultimately, to me, it comes down to mutual understanding and the ability to communicate. I don't know if that's helpful.
Good evening. Great talk. Loved it. But I have a question because, at least from the games that you have shown to us, there is a very clear, at least from your perspective, there is something deeper within from you that kind of drives the creation of those games. And I wonder, is that ever not the case for something that you intend on finishing?
So you're asking if there's ever a game that I don't have a deeper meaning to? Or
Yeah,
that I
it's
wanna make?
just do you ever want to finish something that you just think I'm just gonna make it for the sake of making it, rather than there is a deeper purpose behind making that kind of project?
I'm gonna say no, because I don't get excited enough to start a project until I connect with it deeply. I think I can't think of a game I've actually finished that I didn't care about more than just it as a game, right? I think, and usually by the time I'm excited enough to be okay, I'm gonna commit 3 months to 2 years to this thing, there's usually something a little under the surface or some subtext. So even if it's subtle, there's some higher concept for me. But I don't think that needs to necessarily be true for everybody, and I think it's totally valid to just make something because you feel like making it. So that's just a me thing.
Great, thank you.
Hi, thank you for your talk. It was amazing. So something I really enjoyed about your talk was looking back into other influences and trying to kind of use that to inform your own design, and also looking within games' own history and try not to write off things that come from the past. So something that you described for your own design as being fun forward, I think was so I'm kind of interested, just as a sort of contradiction, in the late aughts, early teens, there was a lot of games that eschewed fun. There were knock games, art games, kind of zine games, things like that, that didn't really like we're not made with the idea of like fun as a central concept. So like how would someone like you who's more fun forward, like what would you learn from, or what have you learned from those sorts of games? Because I feel like a lot of students also want to be fun forward, but also I think could look at things that maybe don't exactly reflect their values all the time. So I think it'd be useful.
Totally. Yeah, so when I've encountered games like that, I feel like when they land, they're really good at something else. Because again, like our brain is wired to be tickled a certain way. And if you want to go against that grain, there's usually some really deeply compelling other part of the game. So, I think an easy example for that is like explicit narrative. Like you can just be such a good writer that I don't care that your game is boring, and then you can appreciate that craft. And then also I think just systemically, if you're not leaning on fun and you're not leaning on traditional carrot stick type techniques, you got to be really good at it. So you're probably doing something else really right in your design. So yeah, I think playing games like that, you just get to see other perspectives of manipulating people through systems.
Hey, I'm going to be the oracle of Twitch chat and ask you some questions that came in through chat. This one's from Floating Fast, who says, what are the gold standard examples of ludonarrative consonants that you keep in your back pockets?
I gotta say the entire Ace Combat franchise is genius. I mean, just Ace Combat 5, I think it has one of the smartest moments I've seen in a game at the end. Do they want me just to list games, or they want me to dig in?
Or give that example. Tell us about the end of Ace Combat 5.
Okay, so Ace Combat 5, obviously it's fighter playing game. You have a squadron, but Ace Combat 5, you actually get to issue orders. You get to, answer through branching text. It's like a visual novel duct taped to, combat sim by way of arcade game, and it's just so effective. Now, the whole game, you learn to basically sight read the screen and see who's on your side, who's not. And towards the end of the game, basically the factions, I don't want to spoil it because I think everybody should play this game. I don't know how you're going to play this PS2 game, but please do. Towards the end, the factionalization kind of breaks down, and there's a moment where you think you're going into a fight and really they end up being your friends. You see it just through the UI, and I was like, that was genius. Like, you have this moment over the radio where it's like, oh wait, those are your allies, and you get to viscerally, because you're preparing to fight, feel the switch of like, oh wait, they're on my side, before you go into one of the biggest battles in the game. Then there's another insane moment after that I will not spoil. But Ace Combat 5, really smart. Mega Man Zero, I would say, is really smart. And man, I don't want to go into Mega Man Zero because that's like a 10-minute thing. But towards the end of that franchise, you are so the alignment of verb and narrative is insane. Like you spend the entire franchise before that. No, we're not doing that. Mega Man Zero, play that, really good. Other good ones. I think I will go to my default fave of Sonic 3 as well, because the narrative is so thin, right? But the gameplay is the narrative. The entire game, you are simply just playing the story. And I think that's something I'd love to see with modern horsepower. I'd love to see games where you don't take the control away from me for a cutscene. A game where you're delivering narrative just through doing, Any game that does that, which is pretty much anything pre-2000, I think is really strong.
Thank you. Okay, I got one more from chat. Let's see. Is there a starting point for you when designing a game? Do you start with, I want to make a racing game, and then figure out the rest of the braid from there? Or do you more commonly start with emotion or something like that?
So is this for me in particular, or just like...
Yeah, I think it's for you in particular.
Yeah. It depends. Like, Killer Auto started just as I want to try to make a multi-dimensional racing game. Like, I want to make a game where you can fly and steer and go extremely fast. And that was just like one Saturday night, I just banged out a prototype just to feel it, right? And then as I played the game, and as I listened to what was fun about it, and as I added features and all that, I realized there was something deeper to it. And that's when I decided to actually really develop the game rather than just jam it So that time I started with just like the fun of like, what do I want to do? What feels good? That's a approach. Another approach is you start with a feeling. You start with a system or a loop that you know work. And from there, you start thinking about what can you add to that. And I think that's more of like a clinical academic approach. I've done that too, but that's more sort of forcing something to happen rather than organic, I would say. Because eventually the shape is going to be decided intentionally rather than like just an idea you had. But I really think it depends what you want out of the game making experience and what you want out of the game you're going to make. If you do have like a deep emotion that you want to communicate, starting with that and working outwards from there, I think it's going to beget a better game than trying to figure out just some fun thing on the side and stitching it to it. But if you really do just have this idea for this, like this grappling hook mixed with basketball or whatever would be awesome, you don't have to wait for that to connect with you spiritually to start. I would say don't start with genre. I think you're gonna pigeonhole yourself into doing done things. If you don't have to start with genre, if you can, especially if you can learn to program from scratch, so you're not so you've resisted temptation to duct tape fixed elements to each other. It'll allow you to work more abstractly and just think about like what rules are in your game. Like literally think if you were making rules for like a child to play a game in a park, but digitally, right? Like start from scratch. That's my main thing.
Nice, thank you. Anyone else? Yeah. Okay. Last question. You decide, Winnie.
All right. Well, so yeah, thank you for your talk. I thought it was great. And obviously, it's a talk that I have a lot of sympathy with. I think it's a view and an idea of how to approach game design that I identify very strongly with. Maybe because I also think of myself primarily as someone who's interested in action game design and that sort of thing. But I would love to hear your perspective because I do think that one of the weaknesses of this kind of framework that talks about, oh, you have these things and they're tightly wound together and they have to all be working in concert, that a potential weakness of that is in something like accessibility, right? Because I feel like what it implies is that if anything changes, the package, like the whole thing unravels, right? That like this kind of idea where everything is touching everything else, any kind of adjustment will radically change the meaning of the thing trying to be communicated or the emotions that the designer is trying to carry off. And I feel like, especially with action game design, that presents real challenges to the kind of idea that people might, like Mega Man Zero is a great example, right? Where like it has one of the most meaningful moments for you that you've ever experienced, and there are people that physically cannot get there, right? Like that is an extremely difficult game that requires like a long amount of practice that some people just might never be physically. I'm not, right? Like I just don't have the chops for it. So how do you think about that? How do you think about the way you approach game design from the angle of who has access to the meaning that you're trying to create and where you're putting that line? Because it seems like if you are designing an action game, there is going to be a line where certain people aren't going to be able to get at the thing that you're trying to communicate, the emotion that you're trying to give them.
Right. Okay, so I think this is something that's just negotiated, right? I don't think you can have a hard line in the sand about this, especially if you want people to enjoy your games. Like if you want, I don't want somebody with a disability not to be able to play my game. So the fact that I want you to hold 2 triggers at once because it feels awesome when you're hitting a drift doesn't outweigh them being able to play my game, right? I like using every color in the rainbow, but I don't want someone who's colorblind not to be able to play my game. I'd rather them play adjusted version of the game and get some of that intent or most of it or whatever else is there that's available to them, and then not be able to play it. So I think that's one element. But then talking about accessibility in terms of like reach or in terms of can like your son play this game or can like my mom play this game or that sort of thing. Mega Man Zero is actually a great example because you can kind of A/B test it because I was one of those people too. I could not beat the classic Zero games like on the GBA, but when they came out with the remastered version with the accessibility options, I was actually able to go through the entire franchise. And now my brother and I, and he was one of the hardcore people who could beat it. We can actually have like conversations about the entire game series based on both having played it, and we got similar experiences. Now, granted, there's elements of Zero that are lost when it's easier, because Zero thematically is supposed to be more difficult than the X games. Like on a meta level, they made the Zero franchise as like harder X for X fans, which was harder Mega Man for Mega Man fans. But then they wove that into the plot too, because it's a plot that X would have been able to easily handle. And you have to go through it as Zero because X is dead, and you will struggle with this. So there's harmony there, which is great, and a little bit of that is lost in going through this game. But it's also so well designed that making it just less difficult doesn't compromise that. And there's a whole other conversation there of difficulty versus challenge, where challenge is, I would say, more valid. Difficulty is just getting in the way. Challenge is asking, can you do this? So yeah, I think it's something, you shouldn't have a hard line on that. I think, especially the type of games I make, I want everybody to be able to play them. So if someone needs to do something to it or if I need to do something on my end technically, and it's not like crazy budget-wise or whatever, because we're still indies, I want them to play it.
Yeah, I think that's a nice kind of verb word on the designer side of like, what are you allowing the players to feel at that point? It's like, depends on the difficulty of the game. Thank you so much for all the questions. Before I thank Ethan, I would like to thank our event sponsors, which I forgot to do in the beginning of this talk. Fresh Planet, Take-Two Interactive, DOTS, and Empire State Development. Thank you for your general support to make our events possible. And thank you, Ethan, for coming and giving this talk. It was amazing. Let's get a round of applause for
Thanks for having me.